The announcement came during what most species aboard the training vessel Perseverance Protocol had assumed would be a routine briefing about cooperative protocols and emergency procedures. Keltoth, the Vrexian administrator whose chitin plating gleamed under the conference room's overhead lighting, delivered the news with the sort of methodical precision that suggested he'd practiced this speech specifically to maximize collective anxiety. The Galactic Cooperation Initiative's survival evaluation would commence in 2 planetary rotations. Teams of 4, mixed species composition, would be deposited on the bioreserve moon Cresciv 4 for 8 local rotations with absolutely no provisions, no communication devices, and no extraction possibility until the prescribed period elapsed. The word "no" appeared with impressive frequency in Keltoth's presentation. No food, no water purification equipment, no shelter materials, no medical supplies beyond basic dermal sealants, no technological assistance of any kind. The gathered participants responded with the predictable range of concern that any collection of oxygen-breathing, resource-dependent organisms might exhibit when informed they'd be experiencing deliberate scarcity. The Dulcaran delegation immediately began calculating metabolic burn rates. The crystalline shards, who didn't technically eat but required specific environmental conditions to maintain coherence, started discussing temperature regulation. The Threen engineer in the 3rd row made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as somewhere between a cough and existential despair. Maricel Okoye, occupying a seat near the back with the sort of relaxed posture that suggested either supreme confidence or complete inattention, listened without comment. She'd already noted 3 relevant pieces of information. Cresciv 4 had a documented ecosystem, the challenge lasted 8 days, and Keltoth had used the phrase bioreserve rather than sterile environment. Everything else was noise. Her assigned teammates found her afterward in the corridor outside the briefing room. Korvas, the Threen engineer whose species resembled an improbable combination of mantis and doctoral candidate, approached with visible agitation. His translator rendered his concern as this evaluation violates basic metabolic sustainability for 17 of the participating species. Probably, Maricel agreed. CN, the Dulcaran navigator whose people had evolved on a high-gravity world and retained the compact, densely muscled build that evolution favored in such environments, crossed her forearms. Your species has participated in similar exercises. Some humans have, Maricel said. I have. The 3rd teammate, whose crystalline structure refracted light in patterns that hurt to observe directly, and whose name the translation matrix had given up on entirely, chimed with a frequency that translated as, "You possess specialized training in resource-scarce survival." "I know how to not starve," Maricel said, which was technically accurate and satisfied the immediate question without requiring her to explain that she'd grown up in a region where knowing how to acquire food from an uncooperative landscape wasn't specialized training so much as practical education. "We should review the planetary data." Korvas made the sound again. The shard, who Maricel had privately started thinking of as G because the full designation was 12 syllables of geometric poetry, flickered with what might have been curiosity or concern. CN simply nodded and pulled up the environmental report on her wrist display. Cresciv 4 turned out to be disappointingly reasonable. Temperate zones, breathable atmosphere, liquid water, carbon-based ecosystem with protein chains compatible with most galactic biology. The sort of place that would kill you through incompetence or bad luck rather than through actively hostile conditions. Maricel scrolled through the fauna documentation with interest. Small herbivores, mid-sized omnivores, aerial species, tidal zone dwellers, everything necessary. We should establish resource rationing protocols, Corvus said, still operating under the apparently widespread assumption that they'd be rationing resources they didn't possess. We should sleep, Maricel said. Long day tomorrow. The shuttle descent happened at dawn, which Keltoth had probably intended to be symbolic but mostly just meant everyone was tired. The deposition site turned out to be a coastal region where dense vegetation met tidal flats in a border zone of scrub brush and exposed stone. The sort of ecotone where different ecosystems overlapped, which meant species diversity, which meant options. The shuttle departed with the sort of finality that really emphasized the no extraction for 8 days part of the arrangement. Corvus immediately began organizing a shelter perimeter. Sayen started cataloging visible water sources. G settled into a position of optimal solar exposure and began documenting atmospheric conditions, all reasonable activities that would keep them busy and feeling productive. Maricel walked the territory. She moved in a widening spiral from their deposition point, staying close enough to maintain visual contact with the team, but far enough to observe without disturbing. The coastal vegetation showed browsing damage at roughly 1 meter height. Small droppings beneath certain trees indicated arboreal feeders. Tracks in the exposed mud near the water edge told stories about size, gait, frequency of travel. A game trail through the underbrush showed regular use, plants trampled but not broken, suggesting something that traveled this path often enough to maintain it. She crouched near a particularly clear set of tracks, 4-toed, clawed, approximately 30 centimeters long. The spacing suggested a quadruped gait, the depth indicated reasonable mass. The scat nearby was partially digested plant matter, which meant herbivore, which meant edible for most metabolisms. "What are you doing?" Corvus had apparently noticed her absence and followed. "Looking at dinner," Maricel said. "We don't have dinner. That's the problem we're solving." "Not yet," Maricel agreed. She stood, brushing dried mud from her hands, and continued her circuit. The cliff faces showed bird nests, too high to access easily but good to know about. The tidal pools contained small arthropod analogues. The forest canopy rustled with the movement of things that lived in trees and probably tasted fine if you could catch them. Sayen joined them, moving with the efficient stride of someone whose ancestors had conquered gravity through sheer determination. The human is correct. Multiple potential food sources exist within territorial range. Potential food we cannot access, Corvus said, vibrating his thorax in frustration. We lack appropriate biological mechanisms for hunting. You do, Maricel said. I don't. Humans are classified as pursuit predators. G chimed from the camp perimeter, apparently monitoring the conversation from a distance. But your species lacks natural weapons. No venom, no claws, no significant jaw strength compared to body mass. Right, Maricel said cheerfully, and began looking for stones. The first day's remaining hours disappeared into what Corvus clearly viewed as an increasingly baffling waste of energy. Maricel collected rocks with specific characteristics, fine-grained, consistent structure, the kind that fractured predictably when struck at the correct angle. She found several pieces of straight-grained wood, the local equivalent of young hardwood, that had grown fast and tall, reaching for canopy light. G drifted closer, refracting the afternoon light into colors that didn't have names in most languages. You are manufacturing implements. Spears, Maricel confirmed. She'd found a good hammerstone and was working on percussion flaking, striking glancing blows that removed neat flakes from the core stone. The technique required a specific wrist angle and enough practice that failure became less frequent than success. She'd ruined plenty of rocks learning this, years ago, taught by someone who'd learned it from someone else in a chain of knowledge that stretched back to when knowing how to make a sharp edge from available materials meant the difference between eating and not eating. Primitive technology, Corvus observed, still operating from the perspective that primitive was an insult rather than a description. Effective technology, Marisol corrected. Another flake came away cleanly, leaving a sharp edge that caught the light. Primitive just means we figured it out early. Most species, the narrator might observe at this juncture, view their pre-technological past with a combination of embarrassment and relief, the way someone might recall an awkward adolescence they've since outgrown. Humans collected obsolete skills the way other species collected rare isotopes, not because they were particularly useful in a civilization with synthesized food and climate-controlled habitats, but because letting knowledge disappear felt wasteful. Some humans knew how to build fires from friction. Others could navigate by stellar positions. Some could make rope from plant fibers or identify edible vegetation or construct shelter from available materials. Marisol could make spears which seemed incredibly specific until it became extremely relevant. By nightfall she'd completed 3 serviceable weapons. The stone points were bound to wooden shafts using fibrous material stripped from a local plant that served the same structural purpose as sinew or cordage. The bindings wouldn't last forever, but they'd last long enough. "Can you teach this technique?" Cien asked, examining one of the spears with professional interest. "Can you throw overhand with rotational force?" Marisol asked. Cien attempted the motion. Her shoulder joints, optimized for high-gravity climbing and load-bearing, couldn't achieve the necessary range of movement. Corvus had the wrong body plan entirely. G lacked a body in the conventional sense. "Then probably not," Marisol said. She tested the spear's balance, found it acceptable, and set all 3 aside. "I'm going to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." The team ate nothing that night. Marisol drank water from the stream. Cien had found a reasonably flat piece of ground, and was unconscious within minutes. She'd been hungry before. You could think while hungry, you could work while hungry, you could hunt while hungry. You just had to decide that hunger was information rather than emergency. Dawn arrived with Marisol already gone. She'd woken in the dark, taken 2 spears, and disappeared into the pre-dawn grey with the sort of quiet that suggested practice. The others woke to her absence and the implications thereof. "Should we be concerned?" G asked. "Humans are endurance hunters," Cien said, accessing species information on her neural interface. Historical documentation indicates pursuit predation over extended time frames. She may be gone for significant duration. Corvus began calculating the caloric expenditure of such activity against the diminishing returns of physical exertion without nutritional input. The mathematics were not encouraging. Marisol returned 3 hours after dawn, dragging something. The creature she'd speared resembled a pig in the way that parallel evolution produces similar solutions to similar problems. It was roughly the correct size, had too many legs, wore scales instead of hair, and was definitively dead. The spear protruded from its chest cavity at an angle that suggested competence rather than luck. The 3 team members stared. G flickered through several colors that the translation matrix struggled to interpret, but probably meant some variation of profound surprise. Cien approached the kill and examined it with professional interest. Corvus simply vibrated in confusion. How he managed. Marisol set down the second spear, which was clean and unused. They water at dawn, single file through the underbrush, following the same trail each time. Poor directional hearing, decent sense of smell. I waited downwind at a narrow section of trail where the vegetation restricted lateral movement. When one passed at appropriate distance, I threw. Once, CN asked. Once, Marisol confirmed. She pulled the spear free with a wet sound that made Corvus step backward. They're not particularly alert for aerial threats. The spear drops at an angle they don't instinctively monitor for predators. The narrator might observe that most species hunt through advantages they evolved specifically for hunting. Speed, like terrestrial cheetahs. Venom, like certain arboreal predators. Pack coordination, like canids. Humans hunt through something considerably less dignified, the capacity to remain motionless for extended periods while experiencing discomfort, then commit sudden violence with manufactured tools. It's not impressive so much as unsettling, like watching someone solve a complex problem with a rock. Can this be replicated? G asked, approaching the carcass with crystalline curiosity. Yes, Marisol said. She'd already begun field processing, using the sharp stone point to make precise cuts that separated hide from meat. But it requires throwing capability and the patience to wait for optimal conditions. You can't force the hunt. You position yourself where prey will be, then wait for them to arrive. Ambush predation, CN said. Persistence hunting, Marisol corrected. Ambush predation is waiting for opportunity. This is creating opportunity through environmental knowledge and then waiting for reality to catch up to planning. She continued working while talking, demonstrating the systematic approach to butchery that turned one dead animal into multiple useful components. Hide, meat, organs, bone, everything had purpose if you knew what to do with it. Most civilizations forgot this once industrial food processing rendered it obsolete. Humans had maintained the knowledge in certain populations, the way you might maintain a fire extinguisher you probably wouldn't need. 40 minutes later, Marisol had constructed a friction fire using dried plant material and patient effort that left her hands raw and everyone else impressed despite themselves. The meat cooked slowly over the flames, rendered from dangerous to edible through the application of heat and time. She offered portions to her teammates. CN accepted gratefully. Dulcorans could metabolize most proteins. She appreciated the warmth, but couldn't consume organic matter. Corvus stared at the cooked flesh with species-specific horror, until Marisol roasted the tubers she'd collected during her morning reconnaissance, utilizing her observation time for multiple purposes. The Furthrine accepted them cautiously. They tasted like obligation and gratitude. Over the following days, patterns emerged. Marisol hunted at dawn, returning with game every 2 days, sustainable harvesting rather than depletion. She taught CN to identify edible plants through careful observation and small sample testing. She showed Corvus how to construct fish traps for the tidal pools using woven vegetation, converting his engineering knowledge to primitive materials. She documented everything with crystalline precision, fascinated by the systematic approach. You operate from comprehensive environmental assessment rather than immediate problem solving, the Shard observed on the 4th day, chiming in frequencies that suggested academic interest. Immediate problem solving is how you starve efficiently, Marisol said. She was sharpening a stone point that had dulled during the previous hunt, using techniques that were older than writing. You need sustainable systems. Know the territory, know the patterns, know what you can take without depleting resources. Leadership, the narrator might note, manifests differently across species. Many cultures associate it with assertion, the loudest voice, the strongest presence, the most aggressive claim to authority. Human leadership, at least the functional variety, often works backward. Someone begins doing necessary work, does it competently, and others voluntarily participate because competence is magnetic and hunger is motivating. By day 5, the team functioned smoothly, not because anyone had established hierarchy or given orders, but because Marisol kept bringing back food and sharing the knowledge that made survival predictable rather than desperate. CN gathered plants with increasing confidence. Corvus checked his fish traps twice daily and had become surprisingly skilled at processing the catch. G maintained optimal solar exposure and provided weather predictions based on atmospheric analysis. They were, improbably, thriving. Day 6 brought an encounter with another team during water collection. This group consisted of species with more conventional survival advantages: a Kryn with impressive mandibles, a Throlian with natural armor plating, a Vespin with venom sacs, and a Quellan who could photosynthesize given adequate light. They looked exhausted and desperate in the way that organisms with empty stomachs and diminishing hope tend to look. The Kryn, who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to social rank mattering, approached Marisol's group. "Have you located the supply caches?" "There aren't any," Marisol said, filling her water container with methodical efficiency. "Impossible. The challenge cannot expect 17 species to survive 8 days without provisions. It violates basic metabolic requirements." "It doesn't expect anything," Marisol said. "It just said no food would be provided." Different statement. The Kryn's mandibles clacked in frustration. "You appear adequately nourished." CN, standing nearby with her arms full of gathered tubers, said nothing, but the evidence was difficult to dispute. "How are you acquiring nutrition?" the Kryn demanded. "Hunting," Marisol said. "Gathering, fishing, the usual methods." The disgust that crossed the Kryn's face was impressive given his facial structure. "You're consuming non-synthesized organic matter." "Yes," Marisol confirmed, apparently not bothered by the judgment. "That's," the Kryn searched for an appropriate term. "Primitive." "Effective," Marisol corrected, using the same word she'd used with Corvus days earlier. She finished filling her container and stood. "There's enough game in the region for multiple teams if you're interested." "We are not animals," the Kryn said with the dignity of someone who'd apparently forgotten that all of them technically were animals, just animals with spaceships and strong opinions about food synthesis. The narrator might observe the profound irony of species that evolved as predators experiencing squeamishness about predation once they'd had several thousand years of industrial food processing. They'd evolved to kill and eat other organisms, succeeded spectacularly, then built civilizations where killing and eating other organisms became socially unacceptable. Humans had never fully industrialized their food psychology. They'd maintained an uncomfortable proximity to their hunting ancestry, which seemed primitive until suddenly it wasn't. The teams parted with mutual discomfort. Corvus, watching them leave, made a sound that the translator rendered as thoughtful concern. "We may be the only team actually eating regularly." Marisol said nothing, but she checked her remaining spear points and mentally calculated how many days remained. 2. They'd eaten, stayed hydrated, maintained body mass and cognitive function. The challenge had assumed scarcity would create crisis. Instead, scarcity had created motivation, and motivation plus knowledge equaled solution. Simple, really, if you didn't overthink it. The extraction shuttle arrived precisely on schedule, descending through morning clouds like bureaucratic punctuality made physical. Kel Toth's team processed each group with systematic efficiency, running medical scans and conducting preliminary interviews. Of the 7 teams deployed across Cresciv 4, Maricel's was the only one where all members had maintained healthy body mass and cognitive function. 2 other teams had required emergency medical intervention on day 6. One team had consumed toxic vegetation in desperation. Another had attempted to synthesize nutrients from local materials and created something that wasn't technically poisonous, but had made everyone involved deeply regret their choices. During debriefing, Kel Toth asked Maricel to explain her approach. She described it methodically: environmental assessment, tool creation, resource mapping, sustainable harvest rates, caloric distribution according to species needs. The systematic conversion of available materials into survival infrastructure. This methodology was not included in preparation materials, Kel Toth observed. Couldn't be, Maricel said. It requires observation and adaptation to specific conditions. Every environment is different. You can't write a manual that covers every possible scenario, so you teach principles and let people figure out application. G chimed in, refracting the debriefing room's light into geometric patterns. Humans possess an unusual combination of traits: endurance physiology, flexible digestive systems, complex tool cognition, and what I term voluntary discomfort tolerance. They can experience hunger and simply continue working. That last part is most unsettling, Corvus added, though his vibrations suggested respect rather than criticism. Most species view hunger as an emergency requiring immediate response. Humans view it as information to be noted and addressed when convenient. We find it motivating, Maricel said. Being uncomfortable makes you inventive. CN, who'd been silent throughout most of the debriefing, finally spoke. Initial skepticism regarding the humans' methods was based on assuming advanced civilizations shouldn't require primitive skills. This assumption was incorrect. The narrator might observe that advanced and capable are not synonyms, a lesson most civilizations learn exactly once, usually during a crisis, that reveals the difference between possessing technology and understanding survival. Advancement means building systems that make daily life comfortable. Capability means knowing what to do when those systems aren't available. Humans, for better or worse, had spent enough of their history being uncomfortable that they'd never fully forgotten how to manage discomfort. Some might call this a failure to properly evolve past primitive conditions. Others might call it insurance. Weeks later, the Galactic Cooperation Initiative quietly revised its survival evaluation protocols. The challenge now included a preparatory module titled Resource Acquisition from Unprocessed Environmental Sources. Attendance was optional but strongly recommended. Several species filed formal complaints about the terminology, suggesting foraging education sounded less primitive. The complaints were noted and ignored. Maricel received an invitation to consult on the curriculum development. She declined politely, explaining that she was returning to her actual job as a cargo logistics coordinator for a freight company that operated in the outer commercial zones. She found container weight distribution more interesting than teaching bureaucrats to sharpen sticks, and the pay was better. The narrator might close with this observation: most species spent their evolutionary history developing specialized advantages. Venom that could paralyze prey, armor that could deflect predators, speed that could outrun danger, strength that could overpower threats. Humans developed the advantage of having no particular advantage, which forced them to become creative, stubborn, and alarmingly resourceful with whatever materials happened to be nearby. In an abundant civilization with synthesized food and climate-controlled habitats, this looks like eccentricity. the odd hobby of maintaining obsolete skills that haven't been relevant in millennia. In scarcity, it looks like magic, though it's just applied knowledge and the willingness to be patient while uncomfortable. The challenge had allowed no food, so the human built spears, caught game, and fed the entire team. Not because it was impressive, though it certainly impressed. Not because it was particularly difficult, though it required knowledge most people didn't possess. But because the alternative was being hungry, and humans have always been unusually motivated by spite toward inconvenient circumstances. Maricel returned to her transport vessel, ate synthesized rations that tasted like efficient nutrition delivery, and read a technical manual about container weight distribution across multiple gravity wells. She'd already forgotten that feeding 3 aliens with handmade weapons was supposed to be difficult. After all, she'd been hungry before. She just hadn't stayed that way.